Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the Genetics Podcast. I'm really excited to be here today with Daniel O'Connor, who spent nearly 20 years working on regulatory policy for innovative medicines, particularly those focused on rare diseases. Daniel spent about 17 years at the MHRA, which is the UK's regulatory body that regulates medicines. And more recently, he joined the ABPI, the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, which is an association of about 120 pharma companies that coordinate around the mission of making the UK the best place in the world to do research, develop and use medicines and vaccines of the future. And we've talked about some of the special things that are happening in the UK quite a bit, from genome sequencing to gene therapies. And this is an area that I really haven't spent much time talking about what goes on under the hood, if you like, at the MHRA and similar kinds of institutions around the world. So I'm looking forward to doing it today. And Daniel, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. Great to be here. Nice introduction. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited. I've been excited for a couple of days just doing the prep work. You've done a lot of public publishing over your career, but you recently put out a paper that talked about how we actually define rare diseases in the age of personalized medicine. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. It seems like on its surface, maybe a straightforward thing to do, but as soon as you start peeling back the layers of the onion of different genetic subtypes and other kinds of different ways to actually think about disease, it probably quickly becomes pretty complex. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
No, thanks a lot. I think that's a really good opportunity to kind of, it does sound straightforward, doesn't it? If you think about, well, defining a rare condition, well, why would that not be simple?
Right.
But I think increasing over my career, when I was spending a lot of time working in rare diseases, so as a regulator, I used to sit on a committee at the European Medicines Agency called COMP, which is the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products. And of course, we have quite a clear regulatory view of what we describe as rare. But as I entered into more other kind of policy areas, so Department of Health, other patient groups, everyone, if you talk about rare and you say, well, let's just we're sure we're on the same page here when we're talking about rare. And actually the rare does mean different things to different people. And there's been some great work recently around looking at trying to get a consensus of what it means to be rare. But the paper you referred to, what we're really looking at was some of the fantastic sort of molecular and pathological sciences that we're now sort of seeing. So advances in diagnostics and really thinking how we might label a disease or a condition even sort of 20 or 30 years ago. But many of these conditions were named after now famous scientists. But
right.
When we think about them now, actually, with our sort of diagnostic tools that we've got, actually, the definition of rare doesn't really fall as easily as it once did, where we have common conditions now that are increasingly, we're better defining them because of the molecular tools that we've got. Even within rare conditions, we now absolutely recognize that within rare conditions, there's a lot of heterogeneity, so a lot of differences between those patients that are within that group. And then a really sort of exciting way about thinking about conditions is actually if you can find common themes, common molecular changes that maybe cross multiple conditions. So it's sort of a concept called shared molecular entities, where you can utilize a really innovative trial design called a basket study to drive efficiency in collecting data. So I think our definition of rare is really crucial because actually that's how you make really good policy and strategy thinking and provision for patients with rare diseases. But you've all got to be on the same page when you're talking about rare. Is it a subset of a common condition? Is it a truly defined rare condition as we currently think about it? Is it a much smaller subset of a rare condition, or is it a shared molecular entity condition that may cross traditionally common and rare conditions?
And so when someone is developing a new medicine, what are the different kind of engagement touch points with the MHRA or similar kind of bodies look like? Because I suspect that they start talking to you really early on, sometimes to say, hey, we think we've got a disease you might not have seen before, or a different way of segmenting a disease that you have seen before by some kind of molecular test. What are the big touch points that you think about when people come and engage with you through that process?
Yeah, well, no, it's great to hear you say early, because I think we say early, 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 and you come as soon as you possibly can. And we don't always see that, actually. I think sometimes, in particular, I think for academics and smaller companies, coming to the regulator can seem to be quite a big sort of challenge. And I think increasingly regulators, not only the MHRA, but I think regulators sort of globally, yeah, are trying to have much more open door policies to engaging with those that are developing innovative products. So absolutely right. Come early. So the touch points, I can talk a little bit from a UK perspective, and then more broadly in other areas, just to give the audience a flavour. But in the UK, the MHRA has what's called an innovation office. So this is a front door, free of charge opportunity for those that are developing novel medicines or novel technologies, novel approaches, can sort of come and have an informal discussion in particular areas, not only in medicines, but also in devices and software, really critical area when you want to, particularly where maybe the science is moving much faster than the regulatory system can flex. So you've really got to understand how can we sort of develop this medicine or other health technology in a way that the regulatory system is able to review it. So innovation offices are really important opportunities for informal advice. There's formal scientific advice, so you can come where you have to put together a kind of a dossier which puts out your position alongside questions that you want from the regulator. So you can come for those kind of advices, and that they're really important, particularly when you're moving into the clinical side of things. So you get buy-in from the regulator around how you might design your clinical trials. So those are sort of advice type approaches. Never to forget that regulators often offer particular incentives to support academics, industry, not-for-profit organizations to kind of engage in areas that are difficult, such as rare diseases, where there's a low prevalence. So you can come for orphan drug designation across many jurisdictions, started in the US, but is now in many countries across the globe. That offers a really important set of incentives to support development programs. So that's another area of opportunity to engage. And of course, you have to engage with the regulator if you want to get a drug license or a marketing authorization. So when you submit all of the evidence from the quality, safety, and efficacy data. But I think the absolute take-home message is contact your regulator as soon as you can. Find out what are the opportunities to engage. But there'll be many different types, and throughout the development program, make sure that you maximize the benefit of those discussions. And I should also say, increasingly important is not only engaging with the medicines regulator for the access part. You also really need to think about, at least in Europe, engaging with the HTA body, so the health technology appraisal assessment bodies, who are really looking at the other part of the access. And in the UK, in England, we have NICE, for example. So you can have joint scientific advice meetings with the MHRA and NICE. Really crucial if you want to try to align some of that evidence generation, which in rare diseases is really difficult because you have less patients. Often you don't know so much about the natural history of the condition. There could be expertise issues that not many people know about the condition. So finding those patients and generating evidence can be really challenging in rare diseases. So it's even more important to ensure that alignment of the expectation around what type of evidence can be generated over what point of time for the different decision makers is crucial. So definitely engage with the regulator, but also think more system wide in terms of what might be the other opportunities to engage.
Yeah, in a moment, I want to talk about some of the big technology shifts that have happened over the last, over the past years. But I'm also interested in actually just diving into some of the regulatory tailwinds that have helped rare disease programs. You mentioned orphan drug designation and some of the others. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what has improved over your career in terms of incentivizing or just making the path easier for people to develop therapeutics for rare diseases. And, I think maybe you could start with the orphan drug designation, because people probably have heard the term, but maybe don't know what the set of incentives are that actually come with that, and also any others that you think have been really impactful.
Sure. So I think orphan drug designation has been truly transformative in terms of raising the interest and the visibility of sort of rare diseases, and helping companies engage with the rare disease space, so to ensure that they get a return on investment, which is obviously really crucial in terms of developing medicines in that space. So orphan drug designation, the criteria are different across different jurisdictions, but really the approaches are the same, is that you have to have a defined condition. And actually there is a difference in opinion between the sort of the North American view of what it is to be a rare condition versus the European one. So you just have to take into consideration when you're looking at your application for a submission for an orphan drug designation, that it's not necessarily the same criteria in each of the countries or jurisdictions that you go for. But you essentially have to have a condition. It has to be rare, and the prevalence or incidence criteria vary according to country. And then you have to demonstrate a benefit of the medicine. And for some jurisdictions, such as Europe, you can come, so from the European Medicines Agency, you can come really early. You can come with non-clinical data. So before you've got clinical data. In the UK, you currently have to have clinical data, and it's done at the point of marketing authorization. But the incentives can be really important. And again, those incentives can range from really early support, such as scientific advice or support from scientific advice or specific scientific advice. But really important for companies in terms of that return on investment are data protection periods or marketing protection periods, which allow for that sort of a return on investment, because you've got a smaller number of patients to cover that investment. So orphan designation, absolutely important. It's increasingly seen as a vital part of industry, but also academics are seeing the utility of coming from orphan designation as part of their portfolio of activities. And again, it's across the globe. I'll mention a couple of other things to think about as support mechanisms from regulators. So, example in the UK is the ILAP, the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway, and this was launched a few years ago. Although it's not specific to rare diseases, it does really try to bring out the rare disease, because it's the sort of the challenge. And what ILAP tries to achieve is a more system-wide approach to evidence generation and approval. So it's, although MHRA is a key player within that, it also includes other really important stakeholders, as I mentioned, such as the HTA bodies, and they collectively work together to try to ensure that the medicines that are in ILAP are developed in a way that the evidence can be used for both the medicines regulator, but also the HTA body. So really important sort of thinking right from the very beginning about patient access and how to sort of facilitate patient access. And then there are other types of opportunity run in other countries, but in the UK we have an early access to medicine scheme called EAMS, which is there to support access when there's some clinical data, but really to try to support access maybe pre-drug license, when there's enough evidence that the benefits outweigh the risks. And that's really important in rare diseases, to have some of these flexibilities around the access pathway, because many patients, as you'll know, that 95% of patients with a rare condition don't have access to any formal medicines or technology for their condition. So there's a huge unmet medical need, and many of these conditions in the rare space are seriously debilitating or life limiting. And so, patients can't wait for decades for products. They really need products now. So there's a really timely therapeutic window that really has to be acknowledged. And so these flexibilities in the license system, such as an approval system, such as early access to medicine schemes, compassionate use, can provide a really useful tool for that patient access.
What are some of the more kind of pragmatic elements of clinical trial design that you have to consider when we think about rare disease? Things that spring to my mind are obviously the rarity of the patient population means you won't always have the kind of sample size that you would necessarily want from a statistical perspective, but also ethical considerations around size of control arms and how you structure those sorts of things, but balancing that against the scientific rigor that's needed. What are some of the maybe differences that you think about when it comes to some of the more traditional common disease trials, and then the world that you spent a lot of your career in on the rare disease side?
I think if we start at the end of the process and then we'll kind of maybe work back, and I think the regulatory system, aside from the orphan drug designation, which can happen quite early on, is the regulatory system sort of recognizes that uncertainty, as you really clearly highlighted. It recognizes that through sort of flexibilities in the licensing system. In the UK and Europe, we have what's called an approval, a conditional marketing authorization, which is, if you like, it's like a temporary approval, like where the benefits outweigh the risks, but there's definitely more data that needs to be collected, and so that approval is renewed every year, and the company is asked to create more, to generate more data, so that those uncertainty gaps are sort of filled. But even more than that, there's an approval called exceptional circumstances, and this is often used for the very or ultra rare conditions, where it's just absolutely recognised the feasibility of running a large phase 3 or randomized study is just it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen in the timeline that's needed. So there's those uncertainties. So I think they're recognized in the regulatory system, and I think that's a really powerful visible approach to kind of say, look, we are, as regulators, or when I was a regulator, we are willing to be pragmatic about the kinds of data. I think coming for scientific advice is really crucial, because ultimately you are dealing with small population research, and there will be compromises that have to be made in terms of the design of the study. It may be that actually the regulators would prefer maybe an underpowered randomized study as opposed to a single arm study, because actually that's the preference, because perhaps there is a product that's already approved, and although it's not powered necessarily from a statistical perspective, actually a randomized approach would be beneficial. Well, it could be that a single arm study is actually the most appropriate due to ethical reasons or the fact of the kind of treatment landscape. I think a couple of areas that are particularly challenging in the rare space is that often we lack really good knowledge on natural history in rare conditions, and that means it's actually really difficult to sometimes know what's best to measure. So we have endpoints in clinical trials to capture the effect of the drug, but if you're not measuring the right thing, you may miss a signal, or you may draw the wrong conclusions around whether a drug is actually working and benefiting in a patient. So these are really crucial things that you should be discussing with the regulator. What, particularly in conditions that maybe there isn't you're setting you're going to be the first approval, hopefully, in that condition. So what should you be measuring? And particularly in patients, you're not always treating patients right at the beginning of their journey in the condition. So obviously what you're measuring may change over time as patients' treatment needs also sort of change. So there are a lot of challenges in small population research, but I think increasingly it's recognized there are sort of novel ways or innovative ways of trying to collect data. I mentioned the basket study right at the beginning. I think that's a huge opportunity for rare disease patients. Increasingly, we're seeing platform technology methodology, so mRNA, gene editing, cell therapy, that again could be used in across multiple conditions. So I think there's a lot sort of coming through in terms of the way we think about generating data in the rare space. But it is no doubt a challenging development program to put forward.
You mentioned a couple of big platform technologies there, and I'm curious which technologies over the last 2 decades have been the most impactful. And then I'm also just going to ask you to make a prediction about which ones going forward you think are going to be the most impactful, and whether some of those may be the same. For example, we've had mRNA have obviously played a huge role during the pandemic and should continue, but I'm interested in any new ones that you think are just kicking off now, but you think will have a big impact going forward.
Yeah, I mean, some of the gene editing CRISPR technology is absolutely fantastic, isn't it? I mean, I sort of remember reading about that in sort of a potential reading about that in sort of 10 or 15 years ago, and then you see it as reality. I mean, how brilliant is that? I mean, that's absolutely fantastic. So I think some of those, the gene and cell therapies that we're now starting to see through. Do we know everything about them? No, absolutely not. There's a lot more to learn. Yeah, there is, but I think they really demonstrated huge opportunity in the mRNA sort of work. Much of it came out of actually when we were thinking about in the COVID pandemic, but sort of utilizing that technology across multiple conditions offers sort of unparalleled opportunity for patients. So I think that's really good. I think alongside, this is a drum that I always like to beat, I think alongside some of these really fantastic, innovative, new approaches to medicines, I think one area that is still really of huge interest and a growing interest, particularly from patient groups actually and academics, is drug repurposing. I mean, really offers an opportunity for many of those thousands of rare conditions where there are no treatment opportunities, and there may be, as our knowledge around the disease and the pharmacology, and there's a link between between those, and you can see where actually a repurposed medicine can happen. And I think the advent of sort of using software, sort of machine learning to sort of trawl all of the data and to start to be able to find some of these opportunities in drug repurposing, I think we'll also see, which I firmly believe is also a really innovative field of drug development, will offer hopefully opportunity for patients. I think one other area is a real opportunity for newborn screening as a sort of technology. And there's huge interest in preventative medicine. And I mean, what better place to start than in rare diseases to get that right, where many of these patients will have, very debilitating conditions, life-limiting conditions over time. But if we can really nail the opportunity of early diagnostic intervention with that pharmacological therapy, then, potentially, many of these patients hopefully never manifest the symptoms of the of the condition, or at least they don't manifest them in the way that is so debilitating or life limiting. So I think this 21st century science is brilliant, isn't it? I mean, there's just so much
Yes.
that's going on, but I mean, right from the beginning, we can align that early diagnostic with an earlier intervention with therapy and a wide variety of therapeutic options now. Hopefully, in the years to come, I think we're going to really see a change. And one way we're trying to do that actually in the UK is we have an initiative called the Rare Therapies Launchpad, which is looking at those patients that have individualized mutations, very ultra rare sort of mutations, and looking at how we can align that health system really from that very first point of diagnosis, but ensuring that pathway is linked and joined up, because at the moment sometimes it can be really challenging that you have a patient that is diagnosed with a condition or has got an actionable mutation, and there's potentially a therapeutic modality at the end there that you could see that actually could be used to treat that patient, but there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of, well, how do you get that patient to that therapy? And what the Rare Therapies Launchpad is trying to look at is, well, actually, how do we build the right infrastructure, policies, and strategy to really ensure that those patients aren't left behind? And there will be a mix of sort of thinking about sort of how to use the platform technology, iterative learning, and really ensure that these patients are treated as soon as possible with a treatment modality that hopefully can make a difference to their lives.
Yeah, definitely. We've talked about some UK specific programs, but also some broader global and pan-European kinds of programs. And I know you've been heavily involved throughout your career with the International Rare Disease Research Consortium, which obviously is a global effort. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how you have worked with this group, but also more broadly how we need to coordinate on an international level for these kind of things, and not just on a country by country basis, just given the rarity and the scale that these kind of studies need to operate on.
Yeah, and I think that it's absolutely clear because conditions are rare. I mean, global international collaboration is a crucial component. I mean, I don't think any single country or any single jurisdiction can do it on their own. And that's I think one of the really positive things around in rare disease research is that there is such an opportunity to collaborate internationally. And ERDIC, as you mentioned, is an international organization, and it has a number of different committees that have a different focuses. It's got 3 goals. One of the goals is around sort of ensuring timely diagnostic for patients. And we know that rare disease patients often spend many years actually not being diagnosed, and huge frustration for patients and families, but also potential loss of opportunity to go into clinical trials or to help with standard of care or any other sort of patient-focused activity if you don't have a diagnosis. So one of the goals is really key to try to ensure that patients are diagnosed as soon as possible. And another goal is around trying to support the delivery of up to 1,000 new therapies for patients with rare diseases where, as I mentioned, 95% are not available. Any therapies are available for them. So ERDIC, I think, provides a brilliant platform for international collaboration. It has some committees, but it also puts out regular calls for task forces and working groups in a variety of different areas. And if you drop onto the webpage, you can see some of the previous task forces, some of the current task forces, and really encourage anyone who's listening to engage with ERDIC when you see a call that might fit your expertise, because it's as a global and international collaboration that we're really going to start to make the changes that we need to for patients.
I read, while I was prepping, I read an interview that you did. I don't remember the exact name of the journal. It was Current Medical Research and Opinion. And you mentioned this kind of ERDIC vision, which I really like because it's very clear and specific. And I'll just quote it here, which is enabling all people living with a rare disease to receive an accurate diagnosis, care, and available therapy within 1 year of coming to medical attention. And that's an audacious goal. And it's very, but it's like, it's I think one we can all wrap our arms around and think about. And I'm curious, sitting here today, besides newborn screening, which I think goes a really long way towards helping to achieve that, especially for genetically driven, early onset conditions, what are the other big building blocks that you think need to come into place to get closer to that goal?
Yeah, I think it's so crucial in a year. You're right. It's an ambitious target, but I think you have to set that ambition because it's absolutely right. Because when you see how length of times, and you talk to patients, how long some patients have had to wait to get their diagnosis. There's a lot about the kind of the way the health systems are sort of set up. So sort of infrastructure and capacity, I think, are really key areas, and you have the right number of sort of specialties specialists within health system, clinical geneticists, others. But I think there's also a key issue around sort of training and awareness. I mean, I remember when I was at medical school, you may be taken to a patient's bed saying you'll never see another patient like this in your entire life because they're
Right.
so sort of rare. But it never really clocked to me what that meant, because at med school you're always taught common things are common. So that's what your brain is kind of drilled down when you're doing your differential diagnosis. So the rare kind of aspect I think it's in some senses it's positioned in a way that it's kind of a novelty, and you think, well, that's a novelty because I've been shown, talk to the patient, had a really nice interaction. But you never then consider that in your practice going sort of forward. And I think it wasn't until I got very involved in rare diseases as a regulator that I thought training has got to be really crucial, not only for medics, but across the health system. So there is an awareness. Of course, common things are common. So that's how you should think. But there also should be an underlying suspicion. Well, maybe this patient has a rare condition, and who would I refer them to if they were rare? And also the other thing around that education piece sort of is the tools that healthcare professionals sort of need, because there's, as an estimate, there people say 6,000 or 10,000, 8,000 rare conditions. I think we can all agree it's sort of thousands. So actually, it's very unlikely that you're, as a clinician, going to know all of those conditions. You need help to be able to do that. So I think alongside sort of the sort of diagnostic tools that increasingly we will have at our hands, I think it's really important that through the education system, the training of healthcare professionals, that rare is not just considered a novelty, it's actually considered something that's really important to patients, and which doesn't have to be right at the front of your brain when you're thinking about common things are common, but absolutely it should be there somewhere, that maybe this patient has got a rare condition. What resources have I got available? Who can I talk to kind of really sense check whether this is something that fits within the rare space?
Moving recently, I say recently, it was a year and a bit ago, across to the ABPI from the MHRA. What about your perspective has changed as part of that? Just moving to a different part of the ecosystem from where you've been for nearly 20 years. I'm curious about that shift. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the ABPI. I did a very quick intro at the beginning, but it would probably be better coming from you, living and breathing it every day.
Yeah, so we're a trade association, so Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, and as you mentioned, we represent many of the large and smaller companies that work in the innovative space. And really, our goal, and I think we really are really passionate about this goal. Actually, is really trying to ensure that the UK is one of the best places in the world to develop medicines. So that's sort of the clinical trials, the manufacturing aspects to it, but also ensure access to our patients as timely as possible when the research allows. So I think in terms of the differences, I mean, obviously I don't work for a regulatory system anymore, but actually the regulatory part is still my bread and butter, because that's my goal. But I think one of the differences is really understanding the needs of industry. I think in the past, as a regulator, you've got your set of rules and your sets of your guidelines and your approach to the way you sort of do things. It's a different way of thinking when you're thinking about, well, what from a commercial perspective or from a company perspective, what are the challenges from a company perspective? And I always understood that to some degree when you do scientific advice, and a company would come and say, well, actually, we just feasibly can't do the clinical study that these are the number of patients we've got. So that's when you hope your regulator is going to be pragmatic and understand, but that's clearly not feasible, those sort of things. So I think it's sort of learning from, because, I think in industry, there's really passionate people that want to create medicines for patients with rare diseases. So I think one of the things that's changed is that I have a much better understanding overall of what are the drivers for industry, but also what are some of the challenges for industry to want to be able to work into this space. And it goes for both, the really innovative technologies that we've already talked about, the cell and gene therapies, the new molecular entities, but also sort of drug repurposing. How could the system change to support some of the more mainstream, larger pharmaceutical companies to engage with repurposing? So I think that's probably the main changes, that I have a much better appreciation of some of the challenges that industry faces when they're thinking about developing medicines for rare patients.
Yeah, the UK is already, I think, objectively one of the best places in the world to do research and develop medicines for rare diseases. But I'm wondering if there are one or two things that you think it could do to be even better. What's on your mind from that perspective?
So we just did a piece of work. It's on our webpage. If you go to ABPI, you can find it. We just did a round table on preventative medicine. I know I've already mentioned it, but it is another favorite topic. So I think it's an opportunity to bring out, because I do think it's not only in the rare disease space, but I think more broadly, I think the opportunity for our health systems is absolutely huge if we're able to shift the dial. And in that round table, it's the first one we'll do probably one towards the later in the year and develop a white paper. There are opportunities, I think, in the regulatory system to really flex to allow preventative medicine to flourish better. And what we need from the regulatory system, we talked about the opportunity for earlier diagnosis, but in earlier sort of pre-diagnosis, if you like, before you're a patient, so you're the pre-patient, what are you going to measure to demonstrate sort of efficacy? So you have to then go to surrogate markers. And is the regulatory system flexible enough around surrogate markers, A, in the approval, but B, also in the sort of the validation of those sort of endpoints? How can we use some of the new sort of software technology we've got in modeling and simulation for dosing? Because dosing is hugely challenging when you think about preventative medicine. When's your therapeutic window? How long do you have to treat for? All of those sort of things. And so it's then sort of thinking very differently about how we use or how we generate sort of data. So I think there's a real opportunity for the regulatory system to lead from the front, if you like, to help to engender some of that change. Whereas the vast majority, and I did this fairly recently, it's a back of the envelope calculation, but I looked at the orphan drug designations on the European Medicines webpage, and there's about 2,200, something of that nature. There's about 90 that are authorized, given a designation for the concept of prevention. And that's a bit of a rough figure, because there may be some within treatment that you could argue sort of look at it a little bit like sort of prevention. But I think it tells you that less than 4% of designations in the rare disease space are for prevention. But yet the opportunities to really help patients in the preventative space is sort of huge. And I really do think that the regulatory system could offer us a huge opportunity to think about creating a preventative approach or a regulatory pathway for prevention, because the issues, I know we have vaccines, but I think the issues are really very unique when you're thinking about developing a pharmaceutical or another product in the preventative space.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and it is, and I think you're spot on with that. Where my mind is going to this is one of the biggest challenges is that kind of endpoint discussion that you talked about, right? Is that the biggest one? Maybe you can talk a little bit about how that might change or become more flexible or different to accommodate this.
Yeah, I mean, if we take a non-rare condition such as Alzheimer's disease, I mean, I think everyone is of the view that, absolutely rightly, we want to treat patients before they get symptoms so that they can still have absolutely normal lives, family lives, working lives. But when do we do that? And when do we understand that? When do we have to treat those patients? How early can we find them? So we need that diagnostic sort of workup, but then we need to be able to measure patients over a long period of time for potentially decades and decades before they might manifest those treatments. So I think it kind of makes us think a little bit about the rare disease space in terms of how do we actually then move from clinical trials to real world evidence.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think the example that I'm most familiar with of a prevention trial running at scale is in SOD1 ALS. So Biogen is running the Atlas trial. And I think that whole, and there's obviously been some discussions around NICE and in the UK of how, whether even to define SOD1 ALS as a rare or ultra rare disease. I just think that whole saga is going to be really instructive in terms of how to do these, but also the next time around, how do we do these better? Because I think probably everyone will look back at that and say, if we'd done these 5 things differently in retrospect, we would. But I am, like you, really excited about a future where we start to identify and treat a lot earlier. But it does seem like when you look at the problem, you've got so many things to tackle. You've got a different safety calculus, someone's not sick yet, so there's maybe a less tolerance over safety issues in the drug. You've got these really long follow-up periods, so there's a lot of challenges to work through. But I think if we break it down, then there's probably a good way to think about.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's how do we sort of mitigate some of these uncertainties? How do we think about the benefit risk balance over time for these patients? And it's not going to be the same for every condition and every sort of patient group, but I do think that's where the regulatory system could lead and start to think about creating some of the real sort of milestones for those kind of products. And that has to come from around thinking about that surrogate endpoint and the kind of the length of the at the time that we have to collect that data. And it's absolutely important for the medicines regulator, but as you highlighted, it's also really important for the payer or the HTA body to understand around, well, look, if I'm paying for this now, even though this person is fit and healthy and well, but actually what I'm doing is that I'm not going to have to pay for that patient in 15 or 20 years' time. And that needs time to kind of work out how those models look like. But I think that's why we've got to start now with the discussion. We've got to look at which parts of the regulatory system could really be enhanced and to support some of those discussions going forward.
How much are those, last question or two here, just given the time that we have, but I'm really curious about how those two questions about, is there scientific validity of the new therapeutic, and then can the NHS pay for it, for example? Are those questions considered at the same time, or are they completely separated in that you make a scientific determination and then can we, or how much would we pay for this is done separately? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that process, because often they're conflated, I think. But
yeah, I mean, at the moment although, as I mentioned, there are opportunities for joint scientific advice, so you may not necessarily have a pricing discussion in those discussions. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't have that discussion there, but you can at least align in terms of what you think is important in terms of evidence sort of generation. But I think there's increasing view, not only in the UK, but also in Europe and in other places, that there needs to be sort of a clearer alignment in terms of how we pull through really important products through the system and ensure that the uptake of those is as quick as possible. I mentioned one called ILAP, the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway, which is a collaboration between important stakeholders. So that's a really important opportunity to help to try to align some of those access discussions, though the individual organizations retain their own decision making, but it does mean that there's a collective, if you like, or a collaboration around that access discussion. But I think what we will see in the future is probably more novel approaches to sort of access, whether it's managed access or other types of approach to access as the technology changes. And there's some brilliant work going on at NICE and other HTA bodies that are really looking at how they should think about some of this emerging technology. And I think preventative medicines is one of them. We mentioned platform technologies. That's another one. Is that a unit of technology that you're going to pay for instead of the kind of the end result of the medicines? There's other initiatives such as point of care manufacturing that may become increasingly part of the landscape, particularly for cell therapies, for example. So all of these things are testing the kind of established system of where we had a nice, comfortable, but a very well understood development program where you had maybe one or two manufacturing sites and a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3 studies. But now we're getting a mix of different approaches with different therapeutics.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I learned a ton. I just want to say thank you. And on behalf of all the listeners, thank you. This was super useful. For people who want to read more of your work or keep track of you, what's the best place to do that?
Find me on LinkedIn. So try and post things periodically there, or maybe at a meeting. It'd be great to catch up with you there.
Super. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to catching up again soon.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity.
That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Cynogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit cynogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible. In particular, Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah, who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies, who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.